Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 324 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. I have another cartridge comparison for you today, where we talk about the 300 Blackout and the 7.62 by 39 millimeter. These two cartridges are remarkably similar in performance at first glance, but if you dig just a little bit deeper, you will see there are some substantial differences in some other key areas that lurk just below the surface. We'll explore all of these things in more detail here in this episode. Similar to episode 322, where I talked about the 5.56 and the 7.62 by 39, I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time discussing the historical roots of these cartridges, but I will hit the highlights to give you an idea of how and why these two rounds came into existence. Both cartridges are the result of a trend started by the Germans to develop what is literally an assault rifle in the purest sense of the definition back in World War II. I'm not talking about the hyperbolic descriptions of assault rifles we see sometimes here in the USA today that are sometimes broad enough to include something like a Ruger 1022 and 22 long rifle in some cases. No, when I talk about assault rifle, I'm talking about the original assault rifle in the strictest sense of the word, the German STG-44. Developed during World War II, the STG-44, or Sturmgewehr 44, which translates into English as assault rifle, utilized a detachable box magazine and was a select fire weapon capable of both semi and fully automatic fire. The STG-44 was also chambered in the brand new 7.92 by 33 millimeter Kurz round. This is what we now refer to as an intermediate power cartridge that had more power and a longer effective range than pistol cartridges used in submachine guns, like the 9mm Luger and 45 ACP, but it was less powerful and it had less recoil compared to full house rifle cartridges like the 30-06 or the 8mm Mauser. You put all those attributes together, detachable magazine, rifle capable of select fire, and a rifle chambered in an intermediate power cartridge, and voila, you have an assault rifle. Now, this is not a great weapon for taking a really long-range shot at, say, 500 plus yards, but this is a flexible weapon that is ideally suited for the most common use cases that people were encountering on the battlefields of World War II, and the same thing has really been true of conflicts since then. It's great and plenty capable during intense combat at close quarters, say inside 100 yards or even closer, especially if you're fighting in an urban environment, but it was also still effective out to a couple hundred yards. And this was not the case of submachine guns, like the M3 grease gun or the Thompson submachine gun or any of the Soviet or German submachine guns that used pistol cartridges. Those were great at close range, but they were a terrible choice for taking a shot at, say, 200 yards. Like you might encounter in a little bit more open terrain. So in short, an assault rifle in a chambering like 7.92 by 33 millimeter was much better suited to the conditions that were most common on battlefields during World War II. Now, even though it did not change the final outcome of the war, the STG-44 and the 7.92 Kurz round impressed the Soviets so much they decided to develop a similar rifle and cartridge after the war. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but the 7.92 by 33 is basically a shortened 7.92 by 57 millimeter round. It uses the same diameter bullet, but typical loads are a lighter projectile going a little slower. And this is because the cartridge itself is a little bit smaller, has a smaller powder capacity, and uses less powder. So for instance, typical ballistics for the 7.92 Kurz round were a 125 grain bullet at 2,250 feet per second. Compare that to a 154 grain bullet at nearly 2,900 feet per second for the full-powered 7.92 by 57 millimeter ball round. So lighter bullet going slower for the 7.92 Kurz. And remember those specs for the 7.92 Kurtz. 125 grain bullet at about 2,250 feet per second. Now, each individual round, because it was smaller, was also lighter too. So each individual soldier could carry more rounds of ammunition for the same total weight for the 7.92 Kurtz versus the old 7.92 by 57 millimeter. Now, the Soviets did a similar thing with the older 7.62 by 54R round and the newer 7.62 by 39 millimeter cartridge they developed. In this case, the 7.62 by 39 used the same bullet diameter, just a shorter case with less powder. Now, while both of the German cartridges were rimless, the 7.62 by 54R, the older Soviet round, was a rimmed cartridge. So in the interest of reliability, they built the new 7.62 by 39 millimeter round to use a rimless case. I didn't mention it earlier, but the Germans did use a couple of different loads for the 7.92 by 57 millimeter cartridge. The same was also true with the Soviets for the 7.62 by 54R. That said, their typical ball load for that round was a 148 grain full metal jacket bullet going at around 2,700 feet per second. Well, the newer 7.62 by 39 fired a 123 grain bullet at about 2,300 feet per second. So once again, the two cartridges used the same diameter bullet, but the newer 7.62 by 39 had a shorter case, less powder capacity, fired a lighter bullet going slower. So that 123 grain bullet at around 2,300 feet per second, pretty similar in performance to the German 7.92 Kurtz. Now, the Soviet round, like I mentioned earlier, had a rimless case, and in addition to that, it also used a highly tapered case to assist with reliable feeding and extraction. And the Soviets adopted a number of different weapons chambered in that cartridge, like the semi-auto SKS, the RPD machine gun, and of course the famous AK-47 assault rifle, and all of the various AK derivatives over the ensuing years. Now, if you put an AK-47 and a 7.62 by 39 cartridge next to a STG-44 rifle and a 7.92 by 33 millimeter cartridge, you'll almost immediately notice they are very similar in appearance. And I wouldn't say they are directly related, but the Soviets clearly modeled their new rifle and cartridge after the German designs. So that is the Soviet 7.62 by 39 in a nutshell. Now let's talk about the 300 Blackout. Now, the United States used the full-powered 30-06 during World War II. Now, ball ammo for that cartridge was a 150 grain bullet at around 2,700 feet per second at the time. And you may have noticed that it is very similar performance to the Soviet 7.62 by 54R. Well, U.S. military leaders also wanted a new rifle and cartridge with many of the same advantages of the German STG-44. Well, they eventually replaced the M1 Garand and the 30-06 with the M14 battle rifle and the 7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO cartridge during the 1950s. Now, while the 7.62 by 51 and the very similar 308 are great for many things, they did not follow the German and Soviet playbook here of using a less powerful cartridge. The 7.62 by 51 is indeed a little shorter than the 30-06, but it had almost identical ballistics to the old 30-06 M2 ball load that I just described a minute ago. So the end result was the M14 rifle was still too heavy and too difficult to control when firing in fully automatic mode. Well, development along those lines continued, and the United States eventually settled on the lighter weight M16 rifle and the high-velocity 5.56 by 45 millimeter cartridge in the 1960s. Now, the original M193 ball load for the 5.56 NATO fired a 22 caliber or 224 inch, 55 grain full metal jacket bullet at 3,250 feet per second. Now, despite its small size and despite the teething problems the M16 rifle suffered in terms of reliability in Vietnam, the original M193 5.56 NATO ammo had pretty impressive terminal performance on so-called soft targets up close, which was often the case in Vietnam. Now, that is, it worked really well when the rifle worked properly. Now, the United States military was oriented towards fighting the Soviet Union at the time, and unlike the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, the Soviet Army started to field body armor in the 1970s and 1980s. And there were, of course, fears that the M193 load wouldn't be as effective on Soviet soldiers wearing body armor. So, in response to that, the U.S. military adopted the M16A2 rifle with a faster rifling twist rate, 1 in 7 inches versus 1 in 12 inches for the M16A1. And they did this because they adopted a new load for the 5.56 cartridge. Now, while the old M193 used a typical lead core bullet with a copper jacket, the new M855 load fired a 62 grain full metal jacket with a steel penetrator. Since it was a heavier bullet, muzzle velocity was lower, and it also needed that faster rifling twist rate for optimum accuracy. Now, the M855 penetrates much better than the M193, but terminal performance was much worse than the M193 on unarmored combatants. We saw this demonstrated in the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, and that trend continued in the early 2000s with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. These issues led to the development of a series of larger caliber cartridges designed to function in modified AR-15 rifles, same with the M4 and the M16 series of rifles, that would deliver better terminal performance on the battlefield. Those desires led in a couple of different directions that led to the development of several different cartridges. In this specific case, though, the case of the 300 Blackout, like we're talking about in this episode, leaders in the military started to look for a new cartridge that would reliably shoot 30 caliber bullets from an M16 or an M4 rifle while still using a standard bolt and gas system in the early 2000s. And they wanted to accomplish several different goals with this cartridge. First, they wanted a new cartridge that performed better than the 5.56 NATO when using standard supersonic ammunition. Next, they also wanted a new cartridge that was more powerful than the 9mm Luger pistol cartridge when using subsonic ammunition. They also needed the new cartridge to reliably function and still perform well when used in rifles with short barrels. The same was also true with rifles with a suppressor on them. They also wanted the new cartridge to function reliably in the M16 M4 AR-15 platform with no modifications other than a barrel change, and be dimensionally similar enough to the old 5.56 NATO round that a standard M16 magazine could still hold 30 rounds of the new cartridge without any modifications. That's a pretty long list of requirements that are pretty specific and difficult to achieve. However, they found the solution with the 300 Whisper cartridge. Designed by J.D. Jones of SSK Industries in the 1990s, the 300 Whisper used a 221 Remington fireball case necked up to shoot 30 caliber projectiles. However, since the 300 Whisper was a Wildcat cartridge, designers at Advanced Armament Corporation, AAC, made a few modifications to the cartridge and got it approved by SAMI as the 300 AAC Blackout. Also known as the 300 Blackout, this cartridge is available in several different supersonic loads. For instance, Barnes manufactures a load shooting a 110 grain TAC TX at a muzzle velocity of 2,350 feet per second, say about 1,350 foot-pounds of energy. That easily exceeds the performance of the 223 Remington and 5.56 NATO cartridge, and it approaches 30-30 Winchester and 7.62 by 39 millimeter performance. More on this in a second. At the same time, the 300 Blackout also performs well in suppressed rifles when using subsonic loads. For instance, S&B makes a subsonic load shooting a 220 grain full metal jacket bullet at 1,060 feet per second. Hornady makes a subsonic offering with a 190 grain sub-X at 1,050 feet per second. In each case, you're looking at between 450 and 550 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Both of those easily surpass the performance of the 9mm Luger with subsonic ammo. In this case, you got a 147 grain bullet at around 1,000 feet per second. And that's giving you just over 300 foot-pounds of energy. And yes, the cartridge also fulfilled those other goals and will also work fine in a standard AR-15 or M16 with all the same parts except for just a new barrel. You'll still get a 30-round capacity in a standard 30-round 223 magazine, all of those things. Now, funny enough, the 7.62 by 39 was initially considered as a quote-unquote better alternative to the 223 and 5.56 in the AR-15 platform. Now, as we'll discuss here shortly, That cartridge will function in an AR, but it's not optimal for that weapon system due to its external dimensions, and it requires some modifications to get it to work properly. It's not just as much of a plug-and-play operation as the 300 Blackout is. It's not technically this simple, right? Like I just said, the 300 Blackout is descended from the 300 Whisper, which is descended from the 221 Remington Fireball. But if you put a 300 Blackout cartridge right next to a 223 Remington, you will see these two cartridges are extremely similar, and the 300 Blackout looks like it uses a 223 Remington case that is necked up to 30 caliber and shortened. Indeed, there are people that do exactly that when forming 300 Blackout brass these days. But it makes sense if you look up both sides of the family tree and see exactly where the 221 Remington Fireball and the 223 Remington came from. They're both descended from the 222 Remington. But anyway, that is a long and roundabout way of saying that because the 300 Blackout and the 223 Remington are so similar dimensionally, that explains why the 300 Blackout works so darn well in the AR-15 platform. Interestingly, the Soviets did the opposite to the 7.62x39 when they necked it down to 22 caliber to create the 5.45 by 39 millimeter round they use in the AK-74. Yes, the original AK-47 used the 30 caliber 7.62x39, and the newer AK-74 uses the 22 caliber 5.45 by 39 millimeter cartridge, and the Russian military still predominantly uses that round today. I just thought it was funny how both countries ended up with 22 caliber and 30 caliber versions of these respective rounds. Back to the 300 Blackout versus the 7.62x39. Like I just touched on, both are 30 caliber cartridges, but they don't use exactly the same diameter bullets. Like most American 30 caliber cartridges, like 30-30, 30-06, all that stuff, the 300 Blackout uses .308 inch bullets. However, depending on where the specific firearm and ammo in question are manufactured, the 7.62x39 typically uses a little bit bigger .310 inch or .311 inch bullets. So they're very similar. You can accurately describe both of them as 30 caliber cartridges, but they do not use exactly the same bullet diameter. They are very similar in overall size otherwise, but the 300 Blackout has a slightly longer overall length, 2.26 inches versus 2.2 inches, but the 7.62x39 has a slightly longer case. Now, since the 300 Blackout is designed for use with the standard M16 M4 bolt, it has the same size rim diameter, .378 inches, as the 223 Remington and 5.56 NATO. The 7.62x39 has a larger .477 inch rim diameter, but it also has a highly tapered case to facilitate reliable feeding and extraction. Now, even though it has that more highly tapered case, which is why AK-47 magazines have such an exaggerated curve to them, the larger rim diameter and longer case of the 7.62x39 cartridge results in more case capacity for that cartridge compared to the 300 Blackout. But on the other hand, the 300 Blackout has a higher SAMI max average pressure of 55,000 psi versus just 45,000 psi for the 7.62x39. So how do those differences translate into different ballistic performance? Funny enough, they're very similar, though the 7.62x39 is more powerful. So here is an example that illustrates this, comparing a Barnes 110 grain TAC TX load at 2,350 feet per second for the 300 Blackout and another 300 Blackout load, this one subsonic, Hornady 190 grain sub X at 1,050 feet per second. Compare those to a load for the 7.62x39 in the Hornady Blackline 123 grain SST at 2,350 feet per second. Now the 7.62x39 has more kinetic energy than the supersonic 300 Blackout load because it's firing a heavier bullet at basically the same velocity as the 300 Blackout. For all intents and purposes, there's very little difference in the trajectory of these two rounds. But the 7.62x39 does have about 12% more muzzle energy and retained energy at 100 yards than the 300 Blackout. Now, both rounds tend to work best at close range, ideally 200 yards and closer for both. That's especially true with the 300 Blackout, though. But across that spectrum, especially where they are both most effective, the 7.62 by 39 does have a noticeable advantage over the 300 Blackout in terms of kinetic energy. Not to say the 300 Blackout is bad or it's not capable or kinetic energy is the end-all and be-all, because it's not. Just realize the 7.62 by 39 is a little bit harder hitting. Now, that's obviously not the case with the subsonic 300 Blackout ammo. It has a very low muzzle velocity and therefore a quite short effective range. But that is part and parcel with shooting subsonic ammo, though. In fact, I would wager that almost every single complaint I have heard about the performance of the 300 Blackout over the years was from someone using subsonic ammo and not realizing how much they were hamstringing themselves by doing that. Now, that load has lots of bullet drop. For example, with a 100-yard zero, it's got about a foot of drop at 150 yards, and it's hitting 3 inches high at 50 yards. So it's a very slow-moving, very arcing trajectory. This makes it difficult to hit an animal precisely with subsonic ammo at anything other than very close range. Additionally, most subsonic loads produce unimpressive wound tracks too. In fact, I cannot think of a worse load to use for hunting than a subsonic full metal jacket 300 Blackout load. Now, a soft point or polymer tipped bullet specifically designed to impact at very low impact velocities, like the 190 grain Hornady Sub X here, is certainly better than a full metal jacket bullet, but it is still nothing compared to a supersonic 300 Blackout load with a purpose-built hunting bullet. That subsonic load is giving you handgun level power. It is more powerful than a 9mm and more or less comparable to a 45 ACP. So if you are going to hunt big game with the 300 Blackout, I think you should very seriously consider using a supersonic load instead of any subsonic load, but especially a full metal jacket subsonic load. We'll talk more about this in a minute. I personally really like the Barnes loads for the 300 Blackout. Those are really good. For the 7.62 by 39, as far as hunting ammo goes, I really like this 123 grain SST from Hornady. I think it's just about perfect. Wonderful bullet for that cartridge. And I think it works very well on deer-sized game at the ranges this cartridge was originally designed for use in. Like I said, 300 yards and in, and ideally 200 yards and in. We'll talk more about ammo and rifles and whatnot here in a minute. Now let's talk about recoil. Both of these cartridges are pretty mild recoiling rounds. They both recoil more than something like a 223 or a 5.56, but both are still pretty mild recoiling and are a big step down from, say, a 308 or even something like a 6.5 Creedmoor. And between these two cartridges, the 300 Blackout has slightly less recoil than the 7.62 by 39 when you're using them in rifles of the same weight. All right, now let's talk about a couple of other pros and cons for each one. First, bullet frontal diameter is basically a wash here. Yeah, they use slightly different diameter bullets, but it's such a small difference, I don't even think it's worth discussing. They're both 30 caliber cartridges, more than adequate for a lot of stuff. What about accuracy? Now, the 7.62 by 39 has gotten a bad rap for accuracy over the years. That is probably due to the fact that most people shooting that cartridge are using cheap military surplus ammo and rifles that we can politely describe as being built to looser tolerances. Now, a good SKS or a good AK is capable of surprising accuracy when using good ammo. But I will still say that the 7.62 by 39 is usually at a significant disadvantage in terms of accuracy when compared to the 300 Blackout when all things are considered. Now let's talk about ammo availability and variety. Both are extremely popular, and there are lots of ammo choices for both of them. Or at least that was true until pretty recently. Now, traditionally, full metal jacket bullets made by companies like Brown Bear, Silver Bear, Tula, or Wolf are the most common choices for 7.62 by 39mm ammo out there. A lot of places stock that stuff. It was pretty easy to find. That stuff was usually inexpensive as well. Ammo like that is great for use at the range. I wouldn't recommend hunting with it though. But those same companies I just mentioned do make some hollow point and or soft point loads better suited for hunting. Now the problem is that ammo is harder to find now in the USA in 2024 than used to be the case. This is due to sanctions placed on Russia after their 2022 invasion of Ukraine. They didn't completely stop the importation of that ammo, and these sanctions were for all Russian-produced small arms ammo, not just the 7.62 by 39. but that meant that everyone who had import licenses for that stuff did not get their licenses renewed whenever they finally expired. As far as I know, here in 2024, all those licenses have expired, and there is now no new Russian-produced 7.62x39 ammo getting into the country now. I do not expect that to change as long as the war in Ukraine continues and these sanctions remain in place. That Wolf and Tula ammo has not disappeared from the market as I record this, but it is not as easy to find or as inexpensive as used to be the case just 5-10 years ago. But there are American ammunition manufacturers that produce 7.62x39 ammo. S&B is an example of a European company that makes 7.62x39 ammo, both subsonic and supersonic ammo, both hunting ammo, and both FMJ ammo, ideally suited for use at the range. For American manufacturers, Federal produces it in their PowerShock line with a 123 grain soft point. Remington makes it in their Core-Lock line, 125 grain Core-Lock bullet. Winchester makes it in their PowerPoint and Deer Season XP lines, both with 123 grain bullets. Hornady also offers a couple 7.62x39 loads as I record this. They make a 111 grain Monoflex and a 123 grain SST bullet in their black line. They also offer it in their subsonic line with a 255 grain Sub X bullet. Now, aside from those two unique Hornady loads, all those loads I just mentioned have ballistics very similar to what I described earlier. 123 grain-ish bullet at around 2,350 feet per second. So there's not a tremendous amount of variety for this cartridge. But I will say all those loads I just mentioned are perfectly suitable for hunting deer-sized game. And like I mentioned, they work great out to around 200 yards. I think that's on the upper end of the range that is best suited for that cartridge. You can use it farther than that, but I think it's better at a little bit closer range. None of those loads are going to knock your socks off with their performance, but there's nothing wrong with them either. On the other hand, there is a much wider variety of ammo for the 300 Blackout. This ammo also includes stuff like full metal jacket ammo and some open tip match ammo best suited for use at the range. But you also have some hollow point, some soft point, and some ballistic tip ammo that is much better suited for hunting. Now, in terms of the hunting ammo, you can really divide all that stuff into four broad categories. First, we have 110 to 120 grain lead-free bullets. You got Barnes with their 110, 120 grain TAC TX, Hornady with a 110 grain CX, Nosler with a 110 grain E-tip, Federal with a 120 grain copper hollow point, and you have Remington with a 120 grain copper core-locked. All of those are going 2,100 to 2,350 feet per second, depending on the bullet weight. I especially like those Barnes loads. I think they are absolutely outstanding 300 Blackout hunting choices. I don't have personal experience with those other specific copper 300 Blackout loads I just mentioned, but they all look very similar at first glance in terms of performance to the Barnes ammo, and they should perform pretty similarly. Now, next we have a couple of lighter weight bullets that are pretty soft. For instance, you have a 110 grain VMAX from Hornady, a 110 grain Varmageddon, and a 125 grain ballistic tip bullet from Nosler. In each case, those are soft bullets pushed at a moderate velocity. Velocity very similar to what I described earlier for the copper bullets, say going around 21 to 2,300-ish feet per second. You're going to get pretty good expansion at those mild velocities and surprisingly good penetration too. Probably not as much penetration as those copper loads I just described, but you're probably going to get more expansion with these bullets. On the other hand, I do not personally recommend using it for this use case, but I have heard good things about the 110 grain VMAX in particular on deer because it expands and fragments very well, but it also still penetrates great at those sedate 300 Blackout velocities when you compare it to the explosive penetration you'll get with that bullet at a faster velocity. So once again, I'm not endorsing necessarily shooting a deer with a 110 grain VMAX, but like I said, you compare shooting that 110 grain VMAX at 2,200 feet per second out of a 300 Blackout versus maybe 3,000 feet per second for that same bullet out of a 308, you're going to get less expansion, but more penetration. And even at that lower 300 Blackout impact velocity, with that really soft bullet, you're still going to probably get great expansion, say compared to a traditional bullet, but it will probably penetrate much deeper than you would think a varmint bullet would. I've not used this bullet on game myself, but I have observed that in ballistic gelatin. It was very interesting to see how that worked. Anyway, food for thought. Next, we have heavier 150 grain loads. We have PowerShock and Fusion loads from Federal for the 300 Blackout. Same thing with the Winchester PowerPoint and Winchester Deer Season XP. All going around 1900 feet per second. These are pretty low velocity loads, probably going to get a moderate wound track with pretty good penetration. Probably more than those really soft bullets like I talked about, probably less than those copper bullets that I talked about a minute ago. Marketed for deer hunting, probably pretty good for that. I still prefer the copper bullets myself for it, but I would not say that these are bad choices either. Now finally, we have the last category, heavier weight bullets in subsonic ammo. 190 grain Hornady Sub X, 200 grain Winchester PowerPoint, both at 1,050 feet per second. Now the thing with subsonic ammo is you have to keep it below the speed of sound or else it's not subsonic. So that means about 1,050 feet per second is going to be the maximum advertised velocity for this ammo. And so you tend to see heavier bullet weights, which is why you're seeing 190, 200 grain stuff for these hunting loads. And then you see stuff for non-hunting loads, stuff used for target shooting and whatnot, 208 grains, 220 grains, that sort of thing. But those two loads, the one from Hornady, the one from Winchester I just mentioned, are both where I would point you if you insist upon hunting with subsonic 300 Blackout ammo. Both are very quiet, both are designed to expand at low impact velocities, but even with them, you are really handicapping yourself if you hunt big game with either load. I'd say they're about as good as it gets for subsonic ammo, but I have not been that impressed with them either compared to supersonic ammo. And this is more of a critique of hunting with subsonic ammo than of a critique of Hornady or Winchester in the specific bullets that they make. Do not hunt with any other subsonic ammunition. Yes, you can kill game with a full metal jacket subsonic bullet, but you are asking for trouble by doing that. Let's move on. Add it all up, you have a pretty good variety of ammo for the 300 Blackout from several different companies. You don't have quite the degree of variety for the 300 Blackout as you would with something like a 223 or a 308, but there is still a really good variety here, and you have much more variety for this round than you do for the 7.62x39. Now let's talk about rifle availability. Now, due to the roots of these cartridges, both the 300 Blackout and the 7.62x39 tend to be most commonly chambered in semi-automatic rifles. First up, both are available in the semi-automatic Ruger Mini 14 and Mini 30 for the 300 Blackout and 7.62x39, respectively. Now, in particular, though, AR platforms are extremely popular for the 300 Blackout, and the 7.62x39 is most popular in a bunch of different AK clones and variants. There are a few AR-15 models chambered in 7.62x39, but they are not nearly as common as ARs in 5.56 or 223 or 300 Blackout or AKs in 7.62x39. This is because the extreme taper of the 7.62x39 cartridge necessitates the use of special magazines, and the large rim diameter of the cartridge requires a new bolt carrier, all of that stuff in an AR. It will work. You can get an AR in 7.62x39 to function just fine. It just takes some more effort for that cartridge than is the case with the 223, 5.56, or 300 Blackout. Now, while both rounds are most common in semi-automatic rifles, you can get both in bolt-action rifles too. For instance, you can get the 300 Blackout in stuff like the Mossberg MVP Scout, the Savage Axis and 110, the CVA Cascade, and the Christensen Arms Ridgeline Scout. It's also available in the single-shot CVA Scout. Both cartridges are available in the Ruger American Ranch bolt-action rifle, and the Howa Mini is available in 7.62x39 as well. All right, one last thing about rifles before we move on. The 300 Blackout tends to work better out of shorter barrels. Remember, this is one of the things it was literally designed for. Part of the reason is the 7.62x39 has a larger powder capacity and it just needs a longer barrel for complete powder burn. Now, while most companies advertise velocities for their factory ammo with 24-inch barrels, the 300 Blackout is usually an exception, and they usually use a 16-inch barrel for those advertised velocities. And there's really not much advantage to going longer than 16 inches for the 300 Blackout. Now, for reference, for example, Hornady advertises 7.62 by 39 millimeter velocities with a 20-inch barrel on their website. Additionally, my Nosler number 9 reloading manual uses a 22-inch barrel for their 7.62 by 39 load data. My Hornady 10th edition reloading manual uses a 20-inch barrel for their 7.62 by 39 data. Both manuals list a 16-inch barrel for the 300 Blackout load data. Okay, now let's talk about magazines. Now, first, since it is more closely related to the 223 Remington and it has such a similar overall shape, the 300 Blackout can use regular AR-15 or M16 magazines designed for use with the 223 and 5.56 without modifications, and they still retain a 30-round capacity with the 300 Blackout. Now, you can purchase a purpose-built 300 Blackout magazine if you want that has 300 Blackout written on the side of it, but regular 5.56 magazines will usually work great with the 300 Blackout. So keep that in mind if you already have a pile of Magpul mags for your AR-15. You can use them. It's no problem at all. There is one vitally important safety consideration to keep in mind if you own rifles in both 300 Blackout and 223 or 5.56. A 300 Blackout cartridge can chamber and fire with catastrophic results in a 223 Remington or a 5.56 NATO chamber. If you try and push a 30 caliber bullet down a 22 caliber bore, you're likely going to destroy your rifle, maybe even cause severe injury or death to yourself or bystanders as a result. Those who own rifles chambered of both cartridges should exercise extreme care to avoid mixing ammunition for these two cartridges and having a very bad accident like that. My local shooting range has an example on display of what can happen if you make that mistake, and the results were not pretty. I don't think anybody got hurt when that happened, but it destroyed that rifle. For this reason alone, it might be a good idea to purchase dedicated 300 Blackout magazines to reduce the odds of a serious accident occurring due to mixing ammunition. And you only use that 300 Blackout magazine with 300 Blackout ammo in that rifle. You only use your 5.56 magazines with your 5.56 NATO rifle. Things are a little different for the 7.62 by 39. Obviously, you don't have to worry about accidentally shooting a 7.62 by 39 cartridge in your 5.56 rifle. It will not fit. But since the 7.62 by 39 uses a more tapered case, larger capacity 7.62 by 39 magazines have a very distinct banana type shape. There are a ton of different magazines for that cartridge for the AK out there, ranging from heavy steel magazines to lighter polymer models. Most of those magazines aren't very expensive. Most of them work really well in most AKs. You need to be a little bit more diligent with 7.62 by 39 millimeter AR magazines, though, but you have a lot of options out there. And if you go out there, find the right stuff that works in your rifle and all that, you can get it tuned right and everything will run fine for you. All right, so with all that said, which is right for you? The 7.62 by 39 and the 300 Blackout are both appropriate for hunting medium game at short to moderate range. On one hand, you could say the 300 Blackout has a slight advantage here because of its generally better accuracy and the larger selection of hunting bullets. On the other hand, you could give the edge to the 7.62 by 39 here since it's a little bit more powerful. That said, both work for hunting game like deer and feral hogs out to 100, 150-ish yards, but keep it under 200 ideally. And if you use good shot placement and you use quality bullets for each one, and there are a good selection of good bullets for each one, they'll work fine. I especially like the 123 grain SST for the 7.62 by 39 and the 110 or 120 grain TAC TX for the 300 Blackout. Like I mentioned earlier, though, use caution when hunting with 300 Blackout subsonic rounds. Do not use full metal jacket ammo. Take a hard look at the Hornady or Winchester purpose-built subsonic hunting ammo if you insist upon hunting big game with subsonic ammo. A high shoulder shot or a shot to the brain or spinal column with one of those rounds will probably drop a deer or hog in its tracks with any of that ammo. But you might be in for a long tracking job with a body shot, though, so keep that in mind. This is why a lot of people prefer to stick with the harder-hitting supersonic 300 Blackout, like those Barnes loads I keep mentioning. Now, do you want the ideal cartridge to use in a shorter-barreled rifle or a rifle with a suppressor? Well, the 300 Blackout definitely has the advantage here. This is because the 300 Blackout was designed for use in a standard AR rifle. It will cycle the bolt reliably when using subsonic ammo and with a barrel length shorter than 16 inches. It also does not suffer nearly as big of a drop-off in performance as the 7.62x39 when using a shorter barrel either. Now, the 7.62x39 will suppress fine. It works fine with 30 caliber suppressors, most 30 caliber suppressors. For instance, Silencer Central specifically advertises their Banish 30 will work with that cartridge. It will also work in shorter barreled rifles, but it's just not quite as good as the 300 Blackout in either regard. And it just sometimes takes a little bit more effort to get everything working correctly. Now, if you want quiet with a capital Q, get a single shot or bolt action 300 Blackout with a suppressor and use subsonic ammo. Suppressed AR-15 will also work fine, but it will be a little bit louder than a bolt action or a single shot rifle. Now, my cheap Diamondback 300 Blackout AR-15 upper works great suppressed and unsuppressed with supersonic and with subsonic ammo. No adjustments necessary. I just swap out the suppressor and or ammo and run it. Don't even think about it. I have never had a single problem. And like I said, that's just with a cheap AR too. The 7.62x39 is just known for being a little bit more finicky in an AR and especially with subsonic ammo. Now, to that end, are you looking for an ideal cartridge to use in an AR-15 platform? Both will work. 300 Blackout has the advantage here because that's what it's designed for. By the same token, if you really like the AK, then the 7.62x39 is the obvious choice for you. Are you sensitive to recoil? Both have pretty mild recoil, but the 300 Blackout has less than the 7.62x39. All right, so that'll about do it for this comparison. This is a great example of the myriad of differences you can discover if you look hard enough at two different cartridges sometimes, even if they have similar ballistics at first glance. Now, I really like both of these cartridges, and I think they're very effective as long as you are using them inside their ideal use cases. And like I've said a bunch of times, deer and hog size game, out to around 200 yards is best for these. Let's not get carried away and say they're great for elk or brown bear or moose or any of that stuff. Yeah, I mean, you can use them for those cases if you want. I just think there are better cartridges for those situations. And the same thing is also true with the 300 Blackout, with subsonic ammo in particular. Yeah, it's better than a 9mm Luger subsonic, but that doesn't mean it's great. So I hope you found this useful and interesting and gave you an idea of the similarities and differences between these two cartridges and the situations they are best suited for and how you can get the most out of each cartridge and hopefully avoid frustration with having bad results using it outside of their ideal use cases. As usual, I wrote a detailed article about these two rounds for the Big Game Hunting blog. There is a link to that article in the show notes if you want to check it out. I've also put links to ammo recommendations for both cartridges in the show notes too. Same is also true with other accessories like hearing protection, slings, scopes, all that stuff. So check out those URLs to learn more. Don't forget, join my email list at huntingguns101.com or click the other link in the show notes. Sign up there, get my free ebook on the best hunting calibers, and you'll also start to get my emails. If you like the podcast, you'll love those daily emails. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening. See you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.